So here's what we're going to do. This is going to be as conversational as possible. So I've encouraged the panel to, they're going to make some comments, but they're also going to interrupt one another and interrupt me. And it's just one way of sort of ginning up some conversations, some challenges, some questions, because in my mind, that's how you come up with creativity, is through the dialectic and through the argument. So let me just frame where this conversation is going to go. And I'm not going to repeat what everybody in the audience knows, and that is that the new entry level to the workforce and to careers is really post-secondary attainment. Pure and simple, that ship sailed. Terminology like not everyone's cut out for college is damaging to the person that's being labeled that way, because everybody is capable of some post-secondary, and it doesn't mean not getting a job out of high school. It means planning for the next step, because the next step is always going to mean continuous education. So post-secondary is essential. The workforce is demanding it. It's the new gateway to higher ed and to fulfilling careers. So here's the dilemma. Here's the sort of interesting contrast in West Virginia. There is a low portion of the workforce that has post-secondary degree attainment, something like 36% of the workforce. That's got to change, and there are a lot of efforts that we're going to hear about that are making some progress in changing that. On the other hand, West Virginia has more institutions of higher ed per capita than any other state in the union. So there are 43 institutions of higher ed in West Virginia. That does include privates, publics, commercial schools, trade schools, the works. But what it says is that there is capacity in this state. There is need in this state. There's obviously a disconnect. Is it about the right programs in the right places? Is it communities tied to employers? Is it schools and employers are not in the right kind of location? So when Brian Nolan was talking about equity, access, and quality, those kind of three variables really drive how we figure out how to take the assets we have and close that gap, make that 60 by 30. You know, the campaign to get 60% of the workforce attaining a post-secondary credential by 2030. And I really want to draw out something that I heard last night that I think is really critical. And Dr. Johnny Moore, president of Pierpont, gave a very eloquent commentary, for those who had the benefit of being here last night for the presidents. And he really spoke to the need to create and craft and shape the educational system around the student. And that becomes the model for how we close that gap. Because not all students destined for post-secondary education are high school graduates. If there are a considerable number of young or middle-aged workers with some degree, some college credits, but no degree, working full-time or part-time, having transportation, family, child care issues, how do we create an educational system around that student? It's customized. It's really finding those students that will be part of the 60 by 30 solution, and they're not all high school graduates. So it's going to take creativity, and it's going to take some redesign. And as Johnny said, it's designing around the student, not figuring out how to get the student to fit the structure. And that was my takeaway from him. And he's been a wonderful champion of advancing the integration of career and technical and academic education and moving that needle on post-secondary attainment. So what we have before us in this panel is an opportunity to hear from three experts, and we'll be able to hear what's happening in West Virginia. We're going to be looking at some unique models of identifying those niche populations or those students who, for a variety of reasons, aren't taking advantage of the system, and models from around the country. So I'm going to give a brief introduction to the speakers. The bios are in your program, so I'm not going to repeat them. And we really want to start in West Virginia with Dr. Sarah Tucker, who's West Virginia, the Chancellor of the West Virginia Community and Technical College System and Interim Chancellor of Higher Ed Policy Commission. We're going to hear from Dr. Russell Wigginton, who is the post-secondary director for the State Collaborative on Reforming Education, and he's had some other experiences in higher ed around college completion and access for populations, unique populations. And Siri Smiley from the Education Commission of the States, and she's a policy analyst, and she'll be talking about some of the novel programs and model programs across the country, particularly those that are applicable to the fabric and the characteristics and the demographics of West Virginia. So let me just start off. They're going to make some brief comments, but then we're really going to try to encourage some questions about what could happen here and what can't, and help feed that last panel of legislators. So let's start with Sarah, if that's okay.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for sticking around at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I know it's been a long day, and for some of you it was a long night last night. We've heard from several people so far on this conference, both last night and today, about how important and how tightly entwined higher education is with workforce development, and it is. But no one has really laid out the statistics and the problem yet for all of you, so I thought I would start off by doing that. We know that in order to maintain the economy of the state of West Virginia, maintain, not grow, to maintain it, 60% of our working age adults need some type of post-secondary training. It doesn't have to be a 2-year degree, it doesn't have to be a credential, it doesn't have to be a 4-year degree, it's all of those things together. But just to maintain our economy, 60% of our working age adults need some form of post-secondary education. Currently, only 36% do. So we have a big gap. We have a big gap that we have to fill, and we need to fill it very, very quickly. I spend a lot of my time working with employers around the state who come to me and say, I need this thing. I need workers who can do X, Y, or Z. We have thousands and thousands of jobs opened up all over the state, from southern West Virginia up to the northern panhandle, up to the eastern panhandle. They're open and they're available. What we don't have are trained individuals who can fill those jobs. And our goal needs to be to close that gap, to make sure that we are getting people, both recent high school graduates and adults, trained with the skills they need, however we need to do it, so that they can fill those jobs. That's the only way that we're going to turn the economy of this state around. That's it. We're going to continue to have a drain on all of our social services if we don't have people who are able to fill jobs that are able to support their families. That's just the reality that we're facing in this state. We also know that 45% of our recent high school graduates do not go on to college. 55% of our recent high school graduates go on to college. 45% don't. The national average is 67% of recent high school graduates go on to college. So we're 12 percentage points behind the national average. If you look at where our recent high school graduates are going, only 9% of recent high school graduates in the state of West Virginia go on to a community and technical college. 9. So we have a lot of work to do in bridging that gap for recent high school grads to make sure that they know the post-secondary options that are available for them, to make sure that they're able to get into them. But then let's look at our working age adults. West Virginia has the lowest workforce participation rate in the country. 54% of our working age adults are working. That's more than 10% below the national average. So we can't just look at initiatives that focus on recent high school grads, and we can't just look at initiatives that focus on adults. We need to come up with a strategic plan in this state that makes sure that we're working with everybody, getting them into the trainings that they need and making them be successful, and knocking down some of those barriers that they have that have made them not be successful in the past. we've done a tremendous amount of work in this area, actually, particularly recently. So we can talk, and I love to talk about the West Virginia Invest Grant, which, as you all know, is our last dollar in program for free community college in the state of West Virginia. This is a tremendous opportunity for our students. Our students' number one reason when we poll people and say, why do you not go to college? The number one reason, year after year after year after year, is fear of the cost of attendance of college. But you know what we found when we got everybody, when people applied for the West Virginia Invest Grant? More people applied who didn't need any money because they already qualified for enough financial aid to fully cover the cost than actually needed the award. It was just telling them that they could go to college for free and that they had to fill out the FAFSA so that they could figure out how much money they get. That's a tremendous opportunity for our state, and it will continue to be a tremendous opportunity for our state. And I thank the legislature very much for their work and making that happen. We also send out automatic acceptance letters every year to every single high school senior. All of our community colleges are open enrollment community colleges. So every year, just around this time, we work with the Department of Education to get addresses for our upcoming, or our seniors, and we send them all a letter, and we send them information about the programs that are available to them and say, hey, by the way, we're open enrollment. Congratulations, you've been admitted into college, so that they know that that's an option. I can't tell you how many parents will call us after we send out those letters and say, what are you talking about? My kid can go to college. Are you sure? Are you sure? Yes, let me hook you up with a local institution and let you know all of the things that are available to them. It's been a tremendous support for our institutions. All of the institutions in the state of West Virginia, 2- and 4-year alike, have changed the way that they're doing remediation. You heard last night and then again this morning that remediation has been a huge drain on the higher education system and has been a big impediment for getting students through in a timely fashion. Several years ago, the state of West Virginia embarked on an initiative to change all of our developmental ed courses into co-requisite courses. So what that means is that students are no longer going into a 0-level course. They're going into a college-level math course, a college-level English course, regardless of their test score, and they're getting extra support to make them successful in those courses. We are seeing students who before would finish a college-level math or English course with a completion rate of around 17%, now to completion rates of 64%. It's completely changed the way that our students are progressing through school. And just as Dr. Moore talked about before, trying to find ways to meet our students where they are, to make sure that we're providing them with the opportunities they need, is what we're finding to be so successful in helping to increase our attainment rate. When we talk about adults, that's a completely different population of students who need a whole different set of assistance in order to graduate from college. I've said this a couple times and I'll say it again. Last legislative session, my son needed tubes in his ears. And I got the bill for what it was going to cost to put tubes in his ears. Had I been a single mom or a single dad at a college trying to make decisions about whether or not I could pay my tuition payment, or my son got tubes in his ears, my son's tubes win every single time. Mm-hmm. Our working adults are making those decisions every time they pay a bill for college. Our working adults are making those decisions every time they decide whether or not they can go to class. If their kid's sick, if their employer wants them to work a different shift than normal, if their parent has some sort of an illness that they have to attend to. These are not students who can just go to school with a random schedule. I'll take a class on Tuesday and Thursday from 12 to 1, and on Wednesday and Monday I'll take classes from 3 to 5. That doesn't work for them. That's not the way that they're set up. And so we have to make sure that our institutions are set up in a way that is responsive to them and making sure that we meet their needs. The other piece of that, and I'll go back to West Virginia Invests, our state has been incredibly kind with financial aid for our students. We have one of the most robust financial aid programs in the country. $90 million before West Virginia Invests, $90 million in state financial aid. Only $4 million was for adults who could go to school part-time. So West Virginia Invests provided the opportunity now for those students to have other options, other ways to support their education and training. We have other options for those adults too. We have internship programs, and you've heard about apprenticeships and internship programs. Our Learn and Earn program, which is again funded through the legislature, is a 50-50 wage match between business and industry in the state of West Virginia. It allows students in our programs to work while they're going to school and get college credit for that work. And the state will pay for 50% of their wages while they're doing that. We've recently received another apprenticeship grant, a $4 million grant for apprenticeships in IT that we're currently pushing out as well to make sure that our students are getting the training, the work-based training that they need while they're going to school. These are the ways, these are some of the levers that we can pull to try to make sure that our students have the support services that they need. But very much like what Dr. Nolan was talking about today, as a state, we have not come up with a comprehensive plan for how to close that gap between the 36% and the 60%. And that's not something that higher ed can do alone. That's not something that I, as the chancellor and interim chancellor, am capable of doing alone. It's going to take a lot of leadership, and we're going to need to work together in order to create a systematic plan for our state so that we can turn it around the way that Tennessee has turned it around.
It's great. Thank you, Sarah. Great overview. We will loop back to some questions on that later. But Russ, please, overview from your perspective.
Sure. Those comments by Dr. Tucker were very much in line, I think, with how we've thought about some things in Tennessee. As my background suggests, I've spent a large portion of my career at a type of institution that hasn't been talked about very much here, and presents, I think, some unique lenses in which to think about what are still some core and fundamental challenges that we all face in post-secondary and higher education. So I spent most of my career at a small, private, liberal arts, very high academic achieving, probably considered wealthy institution. So you're thinking these students show up with 30 ACT scores and all these 10-to-1 faculty-student ratios and all these fancy internship opportunities and all this, they have it made. The reality of it is the students that Dr. Tucker just talked about and the students that show up at places like that and the students that show up at all of our institutions, if you are from a rural community, if you are first generation, if you are a student of color, if you come from a economically challenged background, you show up at that type of institution and any other type of institution not feeling like you belong, or if you feel like you do belong, the nature of the system itself puts forward to you something different that says, meet you where you are. It's very much been set up like a survival of the fittest culture. And so let's think about it. Regardless of the type of institution, the kind of resources that we invest in recruiting students, you spend tremendous resources through admissions to recruit and attract and win over the confidence of these students and their families to invest and to sacrifice and to make the decisions to send you there. Then you show up and the dynamics of how most institutions operate immediately become intimidating and not welcoming and not reinforcing. And so one of the things that I've focused on throughout my career, and something that I'm focusing on as the Chief Post-Secondary Officer for SCORE, is how do we reinforce how we've recruited these students at all of the post-secondary institutions, particularly throughout their entry and throughout their first year. So you can't get to those credentials and post-secondary successes if they don't come back after Christmas or if they don't come back the following fall. And so when you look at losing 30, 40, 50, 60% after the first year, not only do you miss out on tremendous potential that will likely never ever be reached, but you've also perhaps impacted some generational negativity, because that experience is traumatic and will stick with people and may influence how they advocate, perhaps throughout their family, as it relates to post-secondary success. So some strategies to think about. are require some fiscal investment, but I would actually say more importantly is some institutional intentionality around really focusing on deconstruction of language and some demonstrated additional support beyond an academic advisor for a first-year student makes a tremendous difference. And it's not just about having, you do have to have some more people who are focused on that, but it's a separate non-academic relationship piece that really can be powerfully influential for a first-year student. And so I would encourage you to think about, as you're considering areas of new opportunity, thinking about how do we demystify some of the initial challenges that come with being a first-year student, and having people as resources to help students make that transition who may not be advantaged by familiarity with the system or having the opportunity to have spent some time on college campuses or having family that spent time on them or what have you. If you can demystify some of that non-academic, frankly, then the likelihood that students will return and return in increasing numbers is very high. I'll stop there.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you. Siri,
Well,
what do you know from other states?
thanks, Jim. Well, good afternoon, and I would just echo the thanks both to the West Virginia Public Education Coalition and the Hunt Institute for putting this convening together. I think it's a really important opportunity, and especially most of all, I think thank the legislators who are here in the room. I think this is a huge investment of your time, and it's been a great program. So I think hopefully that has been worthwhile. And what I want to say just a word about Education Commission of the States for those who aren't familiar. So we are a nonpartisan, unbiased policy organization that is focused on serving education policymakers in the states. So we're unique in that we get to serve all policymakers, so governors and their staffs, legislators and their staff, state higher education officials, officers, state chiefs, and provide the research and information hopefully to you to help you make better education policy decisions. So we provide, we track every piece of legislation that touches on education across all the states, and if you want to take a look at that and the trends, I encourage you to go to our website. You can play around with it. We also use that information to produce 50 state comparisons and quite a lot of reports on many issues. We answer information requests if you have specific questions that we don't already have a report on, and try to turn those around in 24 to 48 hours. So we really seek to be your education policy team for those state policymakers, and we look forward to hopefully working more with you in the future. And I want to shout out my colleague Joel in the back. If you haven't met Joel, he can answer all of your questions. So, and I serve as a policy director at ECS, and I've only been there for about 6 months. Prior to that, I was working in the state of Montana, and so again, I have a great appreciation. I think there's a lot of similarities for the challenges that Montana has been dealing with over the last decade, and those that I'm hearing about in West Virginia. And one of those challenges is around this connection between providing the skilled and trained workers that the workforce is demanding with our post-secondary education system. And I'm a real believer in the fact that when we say post-secondary, that is all-inclusive. I think there's been a message that it has to be a 4-year degree, but really we need to be thinking broadly and talking broadly about what that looks like for community members, because it opens up doors that for students that they may not otherwise have thought were there. So Dr. Tucker gave the stats for the state, but I think, and as we look across the country, it's a similar picture. I think about 2/3 of jobs require a post-secondary degree or credential even today. And as a nation, we sit at about 47.6% attainment. So this really is a challenge, I think, across the country. And as we look to states, we see some really exciting innovations as to how they're meeting those needs. So I'm excited to be able to talk a little bit about that this afternoon. I think, it really has been both an economic and social imperative to set attainment goals, and this conversation around setting a goal, which is an important measurement, again, of the values that a state places or the country places, started a little over a decade ago. Philanthropic groups kind of led by the Lumina Foundation and supported by states in 2009 set a national goal to increase the proportion of Americans with post-secondary degrees to 60% by 2025. And many states, I think as of this year, it's 44 states have actually followed suit by setting their state post-secondary degree or credential goal, and it ranges from about 55% to 70%, I think, is the range across the states. And it's exciting. I think we can talk about, as we go through this, the progress that has been made. But in that 10 years, the national attainment rate has gone from 38% to almost 48%, so almost a 10% growth in 10 years, which I think speaks to the power of setting these goals and actually creating a plan behind how to get to those outcomes. And one thing I just want to plant a little seed about collaboration. I think every panel up here, and last night we heard a lot about collaboration, and I think that's a really important part of talking about attainment. Again, as just to echo Dr. Tucker, attainment goals are not a higher ed issue. It has to start, there has to be collaboration with employers, the business community, K-12, legislators, policymakers, students, parents, teachers. Everybody has to be at the table figuring these out. And so I think hopefully we can talk a little bit more about that, but I think that's a really key part of this topic, as well as we heard throughout the day, getting the outcomes we want in education.
Great, thanks. Great framework. And bearing in mind that this is a forum for legislators, so I want to sort of try to pitch some questions that will help inform not only the next panel, but the discussions that are going to come up when the legislature meets. And so looping back to you, Sarah, you highlighted what I think are some exciting and progressive policies here in West Virginia. I think I'm not a resident of Pennsylvania. I'm in awe of what your legislature was able to put together last year, and I think it's great. But what would you want to see as a message, particularly for the next conversation of legislators? What would you like to see scaled? What would you think is where we ought to punctuate?
So I'd like to see a lot of things scaled, but when we talked before, and I said that we have to deal with two different groups. We have two different groups of students that we're dealing with. If we're going to meet the state's workforce needs, we have to look at both recent high school graduates and we have to look at adults. So let me focus just on recent high school graduates for a second, because I think that this is something that is scalable and relatively easily scalable. We do not have a good system of dual enrollment in the state of West Virginia. What we have are institutions haphazardly having relationships with high schools or career tech ed centers that are near or associated with them. And if the personalities get along, they may have a program or they may have a class. And the class doesn't necessarily tie in with anything. And so I think we need to be much more strategic about the way that we are doing dual enrollment. I think that the pilot that's happening right now in Kanawha County with Bridge Valley and Kanawha County Schools, which, by the way, was funded in part by Benedum, has a lot of promise. But what it does is it gets students into a pathway. I don't think that the days of taking an English dual enrollment course should continue to be upon us. I think that students should be taking pathways of dual enrollment where they know when they're in high school that they have, and it can be a broad pathway. I have interest in healthcare. Okay, great. So let's take some survey healthcare courses while you're in high school that will apply to your college credit. There are states, and I think Siri can probably speak to this very well, much better than I, there are states all over this country where there are students who are graduating high school with an associate's degree. Why aren't we doing that? We are small enough, we are nimble enough, we can do this, and we're capable of figuring it out and doing it. But we don't have a robust system in place in the state to make that happen. And if we want to change that college going rate number, if we want to bridge that number so that we're no longer 12 percentage points behind the national average, we have to start doing things like that. And we have to be able to have conversations about how to make that work.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, and I want to jump in here because dual enrollment, is one of the sort of innovative strategies that I would say is one that you should take advantage of. One sort of common myth about dual enrollment or AP is that it's for the kids who are smart, they're on track, they want to get a head start. But the fact of the matter is the students who benefit the most from dual enrollment, and this is, research based, and, we saw it in Montana as we tracked our own data, are Pell eligible students that are first in their family, first generation college students, and students who are average students. So their average grade point is a 2.0. Those are the students who get the most benefit out of a dual enrollment class. And I think there's a lot of opportunities to make those, to expand dual enrollment into sort of the CTE fields, the healthcare fields, and give students, again, it's an opportunity to see a pathway that they may not have known existed, and when it's offered in their high school with the teachers they know, in the classrooms they know, and they can see success with it, it gives them that little bit of motivation and courage, and a little bit of credit to get started. I think it's important to be able to do that and make it accessible. I'll just kind of rely on my Montana experience, and we had pretty robust dual enrollment, but last year, working with the Montana University system and the school districts and the governor's office, we decided to do a pilot and make it free. So it was reduced tuition. It's pretty cheap. It was maybe $100 for a class. But that was a barrier for a lot of students not to do the credit. So, and it was eye-opening for me when we went to a welding class across town in Helena to announce the program. There were 25 students in the welding class in the dual enrollment. They were doing the academic rigor of a post-secondary class, but only 2 of them had actually signed up for the dual enrollment credit because they didn't want to pay. Yeah. So they were taking the class, they just weren't getting the credit because $100 was a barrier for them. And so I think as you're thinking about expanding opportunities for dual enrollment, I would encourage you to think about how do you get those students in that you really want to offer that opportunity for, and what are the barriers that may exist, whether they're financial, whether it's time, whether it's transportation, and design your program around those student needs.
I would just add real quickly, don't underestimate the impact of the exposure and the mystique that goes away with students doing those dual enrollment classes. Their ability and familiarity with going to a post-secondary opportunity becomes real when they've already experienced it before getting there.
Those are great points. And before I turn it over to questions from the audience, though, there are a couple of things that resonated with me, and I'd love to give you a chance to just add to it before we turn the conversation over to the hall. And Russ, I want to go back to your unique approach to entry into the higher ed environment for students who are not part of the traditional profile of higher ed, and you tick them off from first generation poverty, rural isolation, ethnic and racial populations, language, how language is used in entree. I think that's critical, and it really goes, all 3 of the conversations spoke to equity. I mean, that's what's really important. The strategic approach to early college. So it isn't a random assortment of electives for those who know what they want and plan on getting there. For those who fall by the wayside, how do we bring that student body up? I think it's critical, and that's exactly what Siri commented on. So let me just say this, from all three of you, is there any one thing you'd like to just pitch out there to the legislators before we turn it over?
Yeah, I would say you all support with the public institutions that that rely on you. Seek those who come forward with new, fresh ideas and degrees of innovation. One of the advantages, private schools have some disadvantages, right? But one of the advantages is that they have to be forward-thinking in some ways, because they're already projecting some of the demographic changes that have been talked about today. That has been in their vernacular for a decade already, because they have to go get those students, and they are already projecting. And in some cases, they are doing better in recruiting students of color, first-gen, lower socioeconomic students. They're already out recruiting the public institutions because they've had to be creative, and they know that if we don't get 500 students in our incoming class, we're going to lay some faculty off, right? It's real for them.
Yeah.
So I would just encourage you to think about those who bring forward creative, innovative ideas and give them full consideration to perhaps pilot and experiment as they, in many ways, compete with some of these other institutions.
This isn't the last word. There's going to be
Okay,
room
there's
to
more
talk,
words.
but please, if you...
So one thing I did want to highlight, just in terms of the national sort of what is happening across the states as they put policies in place to get to their attainment goals. And there's, I would say, three just both key elements and trends. The first, which we've talked a little bit about, is the alignment of the goals with the workforce demands of your state or at a regional level. So I think that's a really important piece, like to make sure that you're not seeking to have 60% bachelor's degrees when what you really need is 40% bachelor's degrees, 10% 2 years. So focus on that, and when you set those metrics and goals, the second piece is to align resources and with those goals. So to support attaining the goals, as well as support the programs that are working towards those. I'll give you an example. Idaho had set an attainment goal of about 60%, and again followed that up with investments both for high school students. So each high school student has a advanced opportunity fund they can tap into for whether it's CTE or dual enrollment, or they want to do a work-based learning internship experience. They can tap into that fund. And then the second thing they did was, to the point about adult learners, is expand scholarship opportunities for returning adults, because I think that's a population that if we're going to get to the attainment, we really have to capture adults that have some college and no degree, or those that have never gone to college. So I think that's an important piece. And then I think to the point of equity, again, if we don't look at the students that have traditionally not come to higher ed or have traditionally not succeeded, we're not going to get there. So being really intentional, both about knowing what those numbers look like in your state, identifying those populations, and figuring out the supports that they need to be successful in post-secondary is a really important example. And again, I'll point to Oregon as a good example of this. After they set their attainment goals, they actually created sub-goals for students of color as well as rural students to make sure that they were both tracking, because what's measured gets done, both tracking and ensuring they focus their attention on those populations.
Great. So let's turn up the House lights and hear what's on the minds of the audience, the legislators in particular. Gail.
Okay. Going back to the options that high school students have in terms of AP and dual credit, I have always been a big supporter of AP because to be an AP teacher, you have to be accredited. That means that an AP course you take in West Virginia is equivalent to the same AP course in Virginia, New York, California, and so there was a credibility built in there. Dual credit has always had a little more wavering. Some dual credit courses, very strong, very good. Others, maybe not so much. And I think part of the dilemma around it was our AP courses being taught by college faculty, either coming into the high school institution or students traveling to the college, or are they being taught by high school teachers, and taking nothing away from that, but it's not the college faculty doing the teaching. So, Sarah, what I would say, my question to you is this. Obviously, dual credit moves you much quickly along the line for an associate degree. But what are the accountabilities to how do we know if our students are taking dual credit, that they truly are taking a college, that they are college ready when they pass that course?
Sure. So accrediting agencies and the accrediting agency that oversees West Virginia, HLC, has started cracking down pretty hard on that. And so they actually are taking a much closer look at whether or not those courses are being taught by mastered level instructors, and if they are in fact the college level course. But what I would go back to is, I don't think we should be having a conversation anymore about courses. I think we should be having a conversation about programs. I think that students need to be exposed to a full panoply of of courses within a program. And I think that's how we're going to move them along. You know, we have relied far too long on saying, well, you know, if you feel like signing up for a dual enrollment history class, you can. If you feel like signing up for AP biology, you can. That's great for the high-achieving students. Those high-achieving students are going to go to college anyways. So exactly what Siri was talking about, the students that we need to be getting to are the students who are not in that high-achieving class. That's the 45% that we need to tap into. And we've got to get them into some sort of robust dual enrollment program or early college I don't care what you call it. You can call it anything you want. And it could be on the high school campus, it could be on the CTE campus, or it could be in the college. But we need to focus in on that. The college would be responsible for that. The college would have to make sure that yeah.
Sorry, please. Can we have a mic? Can we have a mic down here?
Sure.
This question is focused on the suggestion that we try to adopt a statewide strategy to improve the dual enrollment program. And my question from a legislator's standpoint, obviously we're crossing some boundaries there. We've got community and technical college system, perhaps it probably involved maybe HEPC. We've got the State Board of Education. The legislature does not have total control of that strategy, and it's probably desirable that it not. It's really not what we ought to be doing. But my question to you is, how does the legislature effectuate or motivate that collaborative to take place? I mean, do we just simply issue an edict and say do it? How would you suggest we do that? Because I think most everybody would agree that we need to do that. Executive order. I mean, you know, what do you want?
Yeah, so I think in other states where they've seen, you know, they've put in place the sort of statewide effective program. I'll go back to collaboration. I think in part it's having conversations not at the individual college to the schools in their area conversation. It has to happen at the statewide level, that there's some guidelines and sort of goals, again, set around, if the goal is to have a program and not a set of courses, let's set those out at the statewide, let's set that guidance out at the statewide level. I think the legislator's role is to be involved enough in that conversation to know if there are resources that are going to be necessary, because oftentimes, again, if you're trying to make dual enrollment or dual credit classes accessible to students, and you're offering them at the high school, the costs are going to be lower than offering it at a post-secondary institution, but there's still cost involved. So how do you do it in a way that the colleges are not disincentivized for participating because they're getting less money per credit hour, but they're still having to offer the credits and there's still resources necessary. So I think there's got to be an involvement to the extent that you can figure out what are those resources that are necessary. And then in part, it's a messaging and communication opportunity, right? So once you have the components in place, making sure that students and families are aware of the opportunities and can access them. So those would be the three components that I'd say from a national perspective. And Sarah, I don't know if you want to build on that.
Well, I was just going to say that the Tennessee Higher Education Commission recently increased the number of courses from 2 to 4 that are paid for by the state. And they were able to do that because of much of what Siri said. They had the organization that I work for plays a liaison role between a lot of different entities, including government, philanthropy, public, and community. They also talked with a variety of post-secondary leaders who would be eligible to have a percentage or a critical number of students who might be attractive for their institutions. And dare I say, they crossed over and talked with some of the K through 12 leadership in particular areas where they were candidates to be feeders for this. And don't be afraid to try some things on a smaller scale. I think sometimes what happens is there's a need felt that if we say we're going to do this, then we have to go 100% all in early on. And I think that can be paralyzing and stifle creativity and this spirit of collaboration and partnership.
I think also to the extent, we've heard a lot about admission today and yesterday, and that is a big issue in higher education. And so particularly in West Virginia, where there are limited resources and limited number of students and people are sort of fighting over them. I do think that thinking about and plotting out dual enrollment with missions of institutions in mind is helpful. I have been, and the community college presidents in this room will tell you that I've been merciless the past couple years about the dual enrollment courses that they offer, because they're not getting the students that are going to go to the community college. The community colleges have been doing dual enrollment with students in high schools throughout the state of West Virginia, and all of those students are going to a 4-year institution. They need to be looking at a different type of student and a different type of program. And the 4-year institutions need to be looking at dual enrollment programs that meet their missions so that they're getting the students in that they will pull from. But we don't need to all be trouncing on top of each other, and the legislature can help direct some of that work.
Dr. DeNova, we got a question here in the back. Great presentation. I'm Josh Higginbotham, Vice Chair of the House Education Committee. I'm going to ask a question that Dr. Tucker probably has already heard me ask, so it's going to be repetitive for her. As a way of background, a lot of young people know all the options for higher ed. They know there's 2-year and 4-year degrees out there. They know all the options. What a lot of people don't know is that it's attainable. They think that they have to get $100,000 in debt in order to get a 2-year or 4-year degree, which of course there are many options to where they don't have to get an insurmountable amount of debt. So Louisiana and Texas just passed a bill within the last 2 or 3 years, I believe, making FAFSA, the federal application for federal student aid, a graduation requirement from high school. And there are many exemptions, of course. It's kind of an opt-out program. And so for foster families, for a lot of kids who may not have access to a lot of their parents' financial information, there's exemptions. And would a policy like this work for West Virginia as a way of attracting younger people to go to our 2- and 4-year institutions by making them aware of the financial abilities that they could apply for and be eligible for?
In Tennessee, for the Tennessee Promise, that is a requirement in order to be eligible for those funds, is that they do complete the FAFSA. So, and it has not been perceived or interpreted as in a negative way. It's a significant increase in the number of people who are now enrolled in some post-secondary experience.
So that is part of the West Virginia Invest Grant, as you know, that folks have to fill out their FAFSA. And as I mentioned before, what we found is that more people actually filled out their FAFSA and found out that they had enough money to go to school for free than actually needed the award. So it is working in West Virginia. But let me, and you mentioned the exemptions, but I'm on a kick about something right now, so I just want to talk about it. I know, this is a real kick, though, and I'll be as fast as I can. I was at Sherman High School a few weeks ago, and 8 students approached me afterwards. I was talking to them about going to college. 8 students approached me afterwards who were living in family structures where their biological parents were not raising them. They were either with grandparents or aunts, uncles, whatever it was. And they didn't have access to their parents' financial records, and so they couldn't complete their FAFSA. They couldn't complete their FAFSA. And they didn't know how they were going to go to college. And so I started thinking about that and started thinking about what was happening with our students in the state of West Virginia. I contacted the Department of Ed and I said, how many students are living in family structures that are that are like this? And it's more than 40,000 students in the state of West Virginia. It's 11% of our population under the age of 18. 11% of our population is living in a family structure that's not with their biological parent. Now, of course, not all of those families are not going to have access to their parents' W-2s and financial information. And in many of those families, the grandparent or the aunt or the uncle would have gotten a guardianship over them or would have adopted them, would have taken some legal course of action to be responsible for them. But in a lot of those families, that isn't the case. And for students whose parent or whose grandparents, aunts, uncles, whomever it is, haven't taken legal action over the child, that child cannot get federal financial aid. They cannot get the West Virginia Invest Grant. They cannot get the Promise Scholarship. They cannot get state aid. They cannot get federal financial aid until they are 24 years old.
Yeah.
That's the federal financial aid law, until they are 24 years old. Now, they have some options about how they could get financial aid. They could get married. They could have a child and pay for 50% of that child's support. They could join the military. But there aren't a whole lot of options for these kids. And what we have in this state right now is a generation of students who have been affected deeply by the opioid crisis. And they are starting to enter college. And we are going to see more and more and more of them who are not going to be able to access federal financial aid or state aid unless we do something. And we need to do something. I have been working with the judges in the state. I have been working with legal aid in the state. I have been working with our U.S. senators to get this point across, to try to change some of the language around the federal financial aid laws. But we need to keep an eye on this, because if we want to close this gap, we've got to do something with these students. There is a way that an institution can override that. There is a way that an institution can override it. But it is cumbersome. It involves the student having to have the gumption to go to the institution to say, this is the problem that I'm facing and I need you to fix it. And institutions are concerned that if they do too many overrides, the federal government's going to come and audit them, and that they're going to get in trouble for violating federal financial aid laws. This is a nut that we have to crack in this state, and we need to crack it really fast.
And I would just add, I think it's really important as policymakers to recognize even the most well-intentioned policies can have unintended effects when there are additional barriers. And so, I think this is not just a problem for West Virginia. Certainly, it's a challenge that any state accepting federal financial aid faces. And, certainly I think proactively letting students know about the aid they're eligible for is important, and you can really only do that when you have that information. But recognizing and talking to students, right? Talking to their families, either before when policies are enacted, to figure out what these barriers are and sort of figure out the unintended consequences is really important part of this. So one other sort of nut I would just throw out and take away is it really is important, again, to go straight to the students and straight to the families to find out what it is that their barriers are, because they may not be the ones that you expect.
It's a great point to end on. We're going to have to wrap, and as we transition to the decision makers, the next panel, the legislators, I just want to sort of highlight a couple things in 30 seconds that I think are really, really critical that I heard across all three speakers. And one is that we need to move early, really reach into the earlier grades to help students prepare for this transition, but to do it in a very strategic way, that we really need to look at comprehensive counseling and planning and not make it random. Across all the three speakers, looking at a statewide plan that is not a homogeneous plan, but statewide, but rather has unique nuances that really address different populations of need and those that have been left behind given the resources that West Virginia has. And I want to say it again, I think there's been tremendous progress, very positive programs going on, but if people are falling between the cracks and if there are dispossessed populations that aren't taking advantage of it, we need to work harder to figure that out. Language, onboarding, ensuring that transition in. And lastly, to just customize the system around the needs of the students, whether it's 2-year, 4-year, technical, whatever, to figure out the populations in need of completion, wherever they are, and work harder. It's going to take a lot more work than it ever did before. And Russ made that point. I think it's really critical. Figuring out how to make the strategies and find and dig deeper into those populations of highest need is really going to be the ticket to success in closing that gap. On that note, the next panel of legislators being led by the world-famous moderator, Tom Haywood, managing partner of Bowles Rice, literally the man that needs no introduction because he serves on just about every board in the state of West Virginia and Pennsylvania.